One of the things that happens right after the war, and largely as a result of the veterans' benefits that we've just spoken about, one of the things that happens is a shift in the demographics of city and suburb, if you like, the growth of the suburbs. Nick, you've been working on this for a bit, so can you talk to us a little bit about, let's start about what fuels flight from the cities?
Well, so you're absolutely right. We've been talking about the ways in which World War II may have been a watershed in American history, but the period after World War II is a period of rapid transformation as well. And in a way to understand it, we have to go back to the 1930s when the first federal protections for homeowners were created. And as part of this process, the cities, American cities and American suburbs as well, are studied by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, which creates these maps in which color coding is used to designate areas that are suitable for federally subsidized mortgages and those that are not. And this is where we get the very famous term redlining, because areas colored red or rated D by the federal government in cooperation with real estate agents all across the country.
So are you saying that areas that are redlined, let's put it that way, are not subject to mortgage or not available for mortgage borrowing? Or?
Precisely. If you live in a redlined area, it's next to impossible to get a mortgage. And what this means is that as the 1930s turn over into the 1940s, first of all, cities are becoming increasingly crowded. As you mentioned, people are migrating in to work in the war industries. In Brooklyn, the Navy Yard area is flooded with workers, and so you have neighborhoods like Fort Greene and Bedford-Stuyvesant becoming increasingly crowded. And at the same time, these neighborhoods are redlined, often on account of the racism of these practices. The presence of African Americans meant that neighborhoods were almost always redlined,
so
regardless of their status.
Back up a little bit. What criteria are used for redlining, and who makes those criteria? Do the banks do it? Does the federal government do it?
So the federal government creates a handbook. This handbook itself is based on consultations with lenders and with real estate professionals. But this is actually in federal administrative rules. And part of this handbook designates areas that we would today think of as either integrated or in transition as essentially grade D, redlined neighborhoods. They also take into account the quality of the housing stock, the proximity of industry and other kinds of things that would be considered noxious for human health. But the sort of long-range impact of these processes is to discourage lending in portions of major cities, while at the same time, after the war, federal subsidies and the building of highways are opening up the possibility of building new suburban developments.
And so is it folly to ask who gets stuck in the red line districts without mortgages and who gets to move to the new suburbs, or who gets the mortgages, I guess is the question.
Well, it's as you'd expect. Even among veterans, there's a great deal of discrimination. White veterans have access to an incredible array of services. My own grandparents on my mother's side were able to buy a house in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, putting down something like $7 at the signing. And we saw an ad earlier, or we'll see one now, that shows that veterans often had to pay nothing at all as a down payment to begin to own a home in one of these developments. But these were often both because of administrative policies and because of the individual actions of realtors. These opportunities were not open to African American and Latino citizens of cities. And so suburbs become uniquely segregated places. That's not to say there were no African American suburbs. There were certain places where there were, but the suburbs as a whole become deeply, deeply segregated on account of these policies.
And the cities also,
of course,
become deeply segregated, but we would use the term ghettoized, I suppose, deeply segregated into poorer and poorer neighborhoods, whereas the suburbs become increasingly affluent. Is that
And it's not uniform, but this is a process that the historian Arnold Hirsch famously called the making of the second ghetto. That neighborhoods that had been crowded, where there had been little investment, both on account of the Depression and the war, you talked earlier about the decline in the quality of housing, these neighborhoods see themselves increasingly disinvested in or cleared. Clearance is another set of policies we'll probably talk about a little further on in the course, in which housing that had been designated slum housing, tenement-style, low-rise, dense housing, is cleared for the building of high-rise housing. Interestingly, NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, made the case as early as the 1930s that its modern housing would also prevent juvenile delinquency, along with the other kinds of measures we've talked about.
Talk about cities outside the New York area. In the Midwest, does the same thing happen? In California, does the same thing happen? Is this a national phenomenon?
It is, because these are federal policies. Arnold Hirsch's book was about Chicago. In Oakland, Robert Self tells the story of the increasing division of Oakland, which sees an enormous influx of African Americans during the Second World War to work in the desegregated war industries there. By the post-war era, Oakland suburbs are benefiting from the creation of branch plants, certain auto industries, Ford, GM, and also the creation of segregated low-rise suburban housing. But these suburbs themselves don't pay into Oakland's tax base, even though, of course, they benefit from the presence of the port that all of their goods are passing through. And so this is also a process of political fragmentation, and it happens in California, cities all over the Midwest, all over the Northeast, and the South as well, though southern cities fare a little better in this period, in part because they have administrative policies that allow them to expand their governments. Not all of them, but Nashville, Charlotte, Tampa are examples of a kind of counterweight to this history of political fragmentation.
So tell us a little bit about what happens to families on both sides of the red line, if you like. Let's talk about poor families first, and especially the women in those families. Are they still working? What's happening to the kids?
Absolutely. So these families are working, and of course, working class women have always worked, as you've mentioned, and particularly African American women have worked outside the home by necessity in many contexts since emancipation. And so in the cities, this is a time when there is, as you mentioned, a great deal of concern about juvenile delinquency. But we also see the beginnings of a great deal of women's community organizing. It's what the scholar Lisa Levenstein calls a movement without marches. Women working to provide for their children in housing, in schooling, health as well, using the state to respond to the needs that are generated by the simple fact that their homes, their neighborhoods are increasingly dilapidated on account of these federal policies. That said, these are difficult times to be a child. You see the rise both of overcrowding in school neighborhoods that are segregated. Here in Harlem, where we're doing this conversation, there's a great deal of protest by the late 50s about this. The process of slum clearance also generates chaos for families, because as neighborhoods are designated for clearance, families either have to move out, find new places to live. If they can't move to the suburbs on account of segregation, they're moving in with other friends or family. There's increasing crowding. And so even though these processes are intended, as NYCHA would tell you, to ameliorate the lives of families, in the short and often medium term, they lead to more turnover, more chaos in the lives of women and children and men.
I'm thinking particularly of the way that highways get built in order to access the suburbs, and in the process of accessing and making the suburbs more amenable to people who used to live in the cities themselves are split up and destroyed.
That's precisely the case. And that does bring us to the suburbs, because the interesting thing about the suburbs, we know them, and this has, I think, become increasingly well known among historians and the general public, we know that they are racially segregated spaces. But they're also spaces that are segregated or separated, you might say, along many vectors, including along lines of gender and domesticity. So suburbs, as some scholars have noted, are unique in being almost exclusively inhabited by nuclear families with school-age children. There aren't, as you might have in the city, grandparents living nearby, single relatives living nearby, people at different points in the life course. Suburban developments like the Levittowns are almost exclusively inhabited by these nuclear families with school-age children.
Let's take a look, for example, at Levittown, Pennsylvania, which is one of the earliest of these suburban communities designed for refugees from the city, you might say. Talk to us about how it's designed.
Well, when we look at the map, we see these very densely packed suburban houses on winding side streets, set away from the main avenues and the highways, of course, that would allow people to travel into the city. And when we look at these maps, I like to think about the different orbits that each family member might pass through in a day. So we can see that schools are set right in the middle of these densely packed side streets. So if you're a child, at least until you're in a middle or high school, you can walk to school. And of course, children can play in their yards, but can also play up and down these narrow streets where people drive slow, where there's minimal traffic. So there's a world for children, and mothers, of course, move through that world with their children. They go to PTA meetings. They might see other mothers in different contexts. We also see a shopping center at the edge of this development. They would drive to that shopping center, acquire food for the family and such. But mothers and children are largely contained within this development. What we don't see on this map is places of employment. And of course, this is a time of, as you mentioned, increasing pressure, if not the realization of that pressure, for families to be supported by a single male breadwinner. And so the men from Levittown are going to work either in newly created suburban industrial facilities, or they're traveling back into the cities to work in a number of different contexts.
What I'm hearing you describe is what I might call a double isolation. So on the one hand, the men go out and women are isolated in some sense in the communities, but then the houses themselves are isolating experiences, boxes within which women live, in contrast to the tenements or the apartments from which they've fled, where the neighbor was right next door. Here, it takes a little energy to get to know the neighbor.
Precisely, especially if you're all new arrivals, as many people were. You know, we heard when we went through the tenement museum that in 1910, if a person had to go out, a mother had to go out to pick something up or to meet someone, there was always some other mother in the building with whom she could leave her small child. But in a suburban household with the picket fence that bounds you from your neighbor, that's not as common a practice. And now you do have some sociability among suburban women in different, often mother-based contexts, schooling in particular, but you don't have that kind of regularized intimacy of the urban neighborhood anymore. And certainly you don't have grandparents, single, younger, but not yet married women or men around who might also help with those kinds of sociability and childcare issues.
So if we wanted to contrast the new suburban neighborhoods with the cities that are now being redlined and many of them becoming ever poorer, we see increasingly divergent lifestyles for the women.
We do.